Let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name's Nancy Heil, and I'm on the board of the Rattlesnake Creek Watershed Group. Matt Trentman, our other board members here. And our mission is to preserve and protect the watershed and foster connection and care with the idea that the more we know, the more we care. So this series is part of that effort, our Rattlesnake Stories. And just to give you a preview, after today, in January, February, and March, we've got 3 more scheduled. In January will be Tales of the Upper Rattlesnake. February, a bird's eye view of the rattlesnake. And in March, some wildfire history in the rattlesnake. We have a website and a Facebook page, and we also have a relatively new Facebook page devoted to bears and bear activity. So check us out on all those venues. We've got a sign-up sheet over here if you'd like to get our monthly newsletter. We try to be really minimal with the emails we send out, generally just once a month. And we're all volunteer, and we're always looking for help with anything from communications, serving on the board, being on one of our action teams. So if you've got some interest and availability, you can check in with either me or Matt. Today's presentation is being recorded by MCAT as part of a media assistance grant donated to Rattlesnake Creek Watershed Group, and so we want to thank our MCAT camera person back there. Thank you again. Today's speaker is Callie Moore, and she's the collections manager at UM's Paleontology Center. She preserves and takes care of the fossil collection there. She has a recent article in the Montana Natural History Center's magazine that's all about coal seams and plant fossils over in the North Hills. So a fascinating little side piece to this, so check that out. Today we're going to hear about the Ice Age in Montana and the rattlesnake and beyond. So it's a good day to think about the Ice Age. It's not quite icy yet, but we're getting there, and so we're going to go way back in time. And we really appreciate Callie taking the time to be here with us.
All right, thanks for having me. I have given this talk before at the library, but I did switch up a lot of stuff in it, so it won't be quite the exact same. Also, I added a whole section about the rattlesnake. So yes, we are going to talk about the Ice Age of Montana. So winter is coming, but not like it did during the Pleistocene. And so today what I want to go through is what, when, and why of an ice age first. Then we'll get into the geology, the landscape that ice created, and that's where I'll talk about the rattlesnake as well. And then all the animals that would have been living around here during the most recent ice age: lions, tigers, bears, oh my. So let's get started with our overview: when, what, and why of an ice age. So what is an ice age? These are long periods of decreased temperatures and polar ice sheets form. Now, you have a couple of different times. You have a glacial time. This is an individual cold pulse, and an interglacial time, which is an intermittent warm pulse. So these cycle back and forth. So right now, we are in an interglacial because we still have ice sheets. Now, there have been 5 major ice ages over time, but I'm only going to talk about the most recent one. But during Earth's 4.5 billion year history, there have been times when the whole planet was covered in ice, like back in Snowball Earth about 650 to 700 million years ago. And then you have your glacial, interglacial, and then we've had completely ice-free times, like in the Cretaceous period, for example. T-Rex roaming around, there was no ice anywhere on our planet, probably. So, like I said, you are here. You are in an interglacial time right now because we still have the ice sheets covering Greenland and Antarctica. Once those are gone, we will no longer be in a glacial period, and we will be mostly completely ice-free. But you can see how the temperature over the past 500 million years has changed. So the red is hot, the blue is cold, so without, with polar ice caps. So you can see we've jumped over all over the place, and actually today we're probably much closer up here. Good old climate change. So what causes an ice age? Well, for the most part, It's feedback cycles, a lot of feedback cycles. Things feed into one another. But there are quite a few other things that drive these feedback cycles, including ocean currents, so changes in heat, transport. We have solar energy, the amount of the sun, the output that's actually hitting us. We have atmospheric concentrations that we're dealing with right now with all of our CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Orbital variations is probably one of the biggest drivers. I'm not going to go into the Milankovitch cycles today because it's a lot and it's heavy and nobody wants to do that. So just know that the changes in the tilt of our planet, the orbit of our planet, and the wobble of our planet has cycles to it, and they're called the Milankovitch cycles. And even plate tectonics can drive these feedback cycles. So volcanoes, changes in ocean basins, mountain building. So as mountains go up, erosion pulls it down, and that actually pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere during erosion. So a lot of things can drive these feedback cycles. So the most recent ice age happened in the Pleistocene. It's known as the Pleistocene glaciation. The Pleistocene started about 2.6 million years ago, and about 30% of Earth's surface was covered in ice. I like this view. This is a North Pole view. So here is Eurasia, let's see, Britain, Ireland, the Alps, Spain, and then here's North America. So we're over here, right here. Probably. But you can see how much of the northern hemisphere was covered in ice. These ice sheets were up to 2 miles thick, and they resulted in a temporary sea level drop of 300 feet. So Florida was like 3 times the size in the late Pleistocene because all that water is being sucked up into the ice, dropping the sea levels. The mean annual temperature at the edge of the ice sheet was 21 degrees Fahrenheit, and at the edge of the permafrost that came down quite a ways was about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was definitely pretty cold. And this ice reached down to about the 40th parallel, so the Kansas-Nebraska border. Here's a couple different views of North America during the last ice age. So this one is close to the glacial maximum, the farthest down that the ice went during this period. And you see 18 million years, or 18,000 years, 20,000 years, 26,000 years. It kind of depends on where you were at when you get your maximum ice. This one over here is about 12,000 years, and I put it up here because if you notice, there's like a little strip of green, and that's going to become very important to us humans eventually. But here's what Montana would have looked like. This is during the last glacial maximum for Montana, about 20 to 15 million years, or I usually talk in millions. This is thousands. This is much younger, thousands of years ago. But you can see we have our most famous glacial lake Missoula, but we weren't the only one. All the way across the state, there were ice slopes coming down and blocking some type of water and making these glacial lakes all the way across the state. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we will talk about Glacial Lake Missoula because we would have been underwater right now during this time period. So somewhere between 20 to 14,000 years ago, a little lobe of ice came down and blocked the Clark Fork River. And so you can see here's the Purcell ice lobe from the Cordilleran ice sheet. It's coming down. It blocks right here. This is, where is this at? This is in Idaho. Pend-Oreille? Pend-Oreille? Jeez. I'm saying it like my nav says it, which butchers it, obviously. So anyway, so this ice sheet comes down. It slams into that green Monarch Ridge there, blocks the Clark Fork River. It starts to back up, and you start to form Glacial Lake Missoula, and it just backs up into all of these valleys. A little closer at the actual ice dam, this is going to give you some context for the next image here. But so this is a little outlet. So as the lake got higher and higher, anywhere that there was a low spot in these little mountain ranges, the water could go over. And depending on when you were at, so here's the second time it overflowed, here's the third time, the fourth time, and the fifth time. But for this first one, if you were standing next to the Clark Fork River looking at that spillway, so here's the mountain range, here's that ridge that this ice sheet would have come down, here's where the ice dam would have been. So this is a huge piece of ice that came down, and the water would have gotten high enough to spill over that little spot right there. Now, there was about 500 cubic miles of water, and that's about as big as Lake Ontario and Lake Erie combined. So these are not to scale. But the amount of water was about our modern Lake Ontario and Lake Erie combined. Actually, a little more than that. So the ice dam itself was about 20 miles wide. It was 2,400 feet tall, and the water rose to an elevation of 4,250 feet. And that's actually here. So how many of you have hiked to one of the high water marks? We've got quite a few around town, right? So that's where the highest lake level would have been at that time. But when the water got deep enough, it was actually able to float that lobe of ice at the Clark Fork River in Idaho, and it immediately broke up the ice dam. So ice is only 90% of the density of water. So once it gets to a certain point, it'll float no matter how much ice you've got. And then you have these catastrophic floods that come out. The discharge rate was 600 million CFS. And that type of discharge would drain Lake Erie in 8 hours. We think that it only took about 3 days for this amount of water to drain out of the valley. So, woo! Don't get caught up in it at all, because you're going to get washed away. These speeds of 80 miles per hour are probably through Hellgate Canyon. So as the water gets forced into narrow canyons, it speeds up. And so that's probably where the highest velocity of water probably was coming out of, is Hellgate Canyon right here. And the water didn't stop, you know? It flooded all the way across central Washington and went all the way into the Pacific Ocean. And we can find pieces of belt rock, which, if you're familiar, it's our really, really old rock that's around here. It's like purpley and reddish colored rock. Anywho, we can find bits and pieces of our belt rock that only outcrops here all the way into the Pacific Ocean. And so stuff was being traveled, 373 miles. The water from Glacial Lake Missoula went all the way over. And it did this repeatedly. And the numbers are pretty astounding. Most of you in here has probably seen this outcropping, this road cut. This is on I-90 right near 9 Mile. When you're driving down now think to look as you're coming around this curve. These are the 9 Mile rhythmites. And the darker layers represent the lake times, and the lighter layers represent the flood times. And in just this outcrop, we have 36 sequences of refillings and floodings. Refillings and flooding, refilling and flooding, and refilling and flooding. The oldest one took about 57 years to fill before it failed, but the last one only took about 6 years. So as we're moving closer to today, the climate is warming up. Even if it is an ice age, it's still getting a little bit warmer. So we see that the first floods coming out of Glacial Lake Missoula were the worst. They were the biggest. And then as we get closer to today, they weaken over time. So now let's talk about the geology and the landscape that ice created. And so I'm going to show you kind of some classic glacial features from here in Montana. And most of these are obviously going to be from Glacier National Park, but I will, promise you, get to the rattlesnake. But I want to show you some really, really classic images before we start looking into the rattlesnake. So these are some of the features that we're going to be talking about here. You have this retreating glacier. They make these weird drumlins, which are my favorite glacial feature because everybody needs a favorite glacial feature. We have moraines, so that's when the ice comes down and stops and starts retreating. Ice is basically like a bulldozer, so it pushes up a bunch of sediment. You got these weird little things called kettles that we're going to go through. And then you have all of kind of the mountain features. So as this main glacier is coming down, it carves out a U-shaped valley. You have all these kind of tributary glaciers coming down, creating hanging valleys. You have horns like the Matterhorn, ariettes, tarns, cirques, all sorts of amazing things that are created by glaciers. So let's look at some. Whoops. Moraines. Let's start with moraines because I think the easiest one to see is Pleistocene. Pleistocene is a moraine. So you can see here, the Pleistocene, the flathead lobe comes down and stops here and pushes all of that stuff right up. And boom, as you're driving into Pleistocene, that little hill next to the lake, that is the moraine from a giant glacier that came down in the flathead. And you can see that this one is the Pinedale glaciation that created Pleistocene, but then there's another one a little farther down from the Bull Lake glaciation. So there's been multiple glaciations. I'm mainly focusing on the Pinedale today. But just know that there were many different glaciations and pulses of these glaciers over time. The other thing is Lake Mary Ronan is a moraine lake. So the moraine actually impounded a little stream to create Lake Mary Ronan as well. Then you have these beautiful classic U-shaped valleys from going to the Sun Road. So you can see there, so nice, so nice. Anytime you see a U-shaped valley that's wonderfully curved like this, so smooth, glacial ice. Here's an ariette. So these are like jagged, almost knife blades that occur when you've got glaciers on both sides, and they just basically sharpen the ridge of a glacier. This is the garden wall at Glacier National Park. And yes, so it's separating two glaciers. There's one on one side, there's one on the other, and it just carves this knife blade at the top. Oh yeah, and a col is where it finally carves it down so much that the ice can touch across it. Here's your horn. This is Flinch Peak that you can go to. It also has a cirque and a tarn, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But this is where 3 glaciers come together and carve out almost a pyramid at the top. And here we go, the cirques and tarns. So cirques are these areas that it's kind of, think of it like the nucleus of a glacier. So this is kind of where it starts, and then it fills out down the valleys from there. But when the ice melts, it fills up with a lake that's called a tarn. I don't know where this picture was taken, though. I'm sorry. Hanging valleys. So this is Bird Woman Falls, right here. And you can see, here's the edge of a big U-shaped valley. It would go like this over here off the picture. So here's our main channel. And then there would have been another glacier coming out, like a tributary glacier, coming out and meeting up with the big glacier. And it creates these hanging walls, and you get all the lovely waterfalls usually coming off of them. Kettles are very weird. Most people agree that Nine Pipes is a kettle feature. So all of these little perfect circles everywhere that you see are when a glacier is retreating, it kind of drops off what's known as dead ice from the front of it. Big chunks of ice that just break off. And as you know, ice takes a long time to melt, especially if it's staying below freezing all the time. But the outwash, so all the water coming off the glacier is still moving sediment, and it buries those big chunks of ice. Eventually, they do melt and cause little depressions. So then you get these perfectly round little lakes all over the place. There is another process that they could be, but I think that they're kettles. I personally think they're kettles with all of my vast knowledge of glacial features. But so Nine Pipe is a really great place to think about glaciation as well. Then my favorite, I'm so happy we have these in the state. I think they're one of the rarest features. These are drumlins. And right near the Canadian border, up in Eureka, is where we have this swarm of drumlins all over the place. The best ones are on the American side. I have yet to go up there. It's on the list, though. So these things are very weird. There's some really big ones near the Great Lakes where some of those bigger ice lobes came down, and it confused geologists for hundreds of years. We had literally no idea how ice was creating these really interesting structures, right? So you have this steep slope and the mild slope here, the high point to a low point. You get these swarms, they form together. What is happening? I hope this works. Yeah? No? Somebody who did finally figure it out. I swear I embedded this. You can do it. You can do it. Oh, it's not going to do it. Okay, remind me. We'll come back. We'll watch this video at the end. I'll put it in a browser, and we'll pull it up. I can't believe it didn't work. I tested all of this before I came here, and it worked. Okay, so anyways, basically the ice is moving over it, and all the stuff is getting piled up and scraped off kind of at the same time. It's a pretty cool video. We'll watch it at the end, I promise. And then, of course, giant ripple marks. So these are the largest ripple marks in the entire world. It's right here at Camas Prairie. If you've never been out to see these, they're pretty spectacular, but they're hard to see when you're just standing there because these hills are, you know, as tall as this room, taller than this room, and it's kind of hard to get a sense. This is a nice aerial photograph so you can see all of these ripples coming out. And so this was a big outwash area for all of that water coming out of Glacial Lake Missoula, the floods. So the floods created these. I would definitely say go where the light is kind of at a little lower of an angle. So it really shows off the shadowing between the ridges. If you go at like noon, you can't really see anything. Or on a cloudy day, you can't really see anything. And those are the 2 days that I have visited. So yes, definitely go maybe towards the evening or the early morning and get some of that lower angle light, and you'll be able to see them beautifully. Then we also have erratics. This is my only picture not technically from Montana. It's from Yellowstone, but Wyoming Yellowstone, not the Montana one. But you can also see these near Browning as well. But they're big chunks of rock that don't seem like they should be there. Where did these big chunks of rock come from? Sometimes when a glacier is cruising along, it'll pick up big chunks of ice, and then it meets a body of water, it starts to melt, and then the rocks drop out of it. So they're iceberg. They like literally calve from icebergs. That might be what was going on here. This would have been the Yellowstone glaciation. So Yellowstone was also glaciated during the late Pleistocene as well. This one probably is familiar to everybody. It's on campus. It's the 1898 rock on the oval. This one, I've seen a lot of people say that it was an iceberg dropped erratic, but I don't think it is. And there's a lot, actually, once I started reading more, it doesn't seem like people think it is either. They think it's still an erratic, but it was a flood erratic. And so you know how I mentioned that the fastest water was coming through Hellgate Canyon. Well, it was literally ripping chunks of rock off of the wall. And as the water came through Hellgate Canyon and was able to spread out, it slowed down and dropped all these big chunks of rock around downtown Missoula and the one on the oval. This one goes down much, much farther underground. This is like the tip of the iceberg of this rock here. But this was probably just ripped from the side of Hellgate Canyon and deposited on campus that way, as opposed to being carried in an iceberg and dropped while the lake was still here. Then the strand lines. Oh, these are so cool. I think February is probably the best time of year to see the strand lines. So these are marking the lake lines of Lake Missoula. But I mentioned earlier that the floods weakened over time. So the ones at the top of Mount Sentinel or Jumbo or wherever you're looking at the strand lines are, the ones at the top were some of the first floods, and the ones at the bottom are the last floods. So every time the water would come up, it really wouldn't go up any farther than the time before. And if it did, it would keep wiping out all these lines. And so basically, you just have a slowly weakening flood system as you go. But Missoula was at least 900 feet underwater right here. Like the University of Montana is one of the lowest spots in town, and we would have been 900 feet below the surface. That's deeper than Flathead Lake, which is the deepest lake west of the Mississippi or whatever. And so Glacial Lake Missoula would have actually been a bigger, deeper lake than Flathead Lake, which is also made by glaciers. Finally, here we are, the moment you've all been waiting for, the Rattlesnake Creek Valley. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this graphic because I got it from your website. This is showing the whole watershed. And the boundary is the dark green line here, and that's the area that I'm going to be focusing on. So let's zoom in on this northern portion first and see what kind of things we can pick out. So you might start noticing, again, all of these little lakes. There's over 30 lakes in the northern part of the Rattlesnake, and these represent cirques and tarns. So this is a little nucleus here, and then the glacial ice would have come out of it. There's a really nice, oh man, this is harder to see than on my computer. There's some really good ice lobes coming down here. They would have all connected to Rattlesnake Creek eventually. And so you've got some of these nice U-shaped valleys here oh yeah, here it is. This big one here. So these are cirques and tarns. So the cirque is the depression that the glacier made, and the tarn is the lake that filled it up eventually. Let's look at this little, what is this? This is McKinley Lake, because I think it's pretty. And so here is your tarn, and then you can see kind of the U-shaped valley coming out of it there. And let's also look at Sanders Lake, because it has probably one of the best preserved moraines from a cirque. And I think it's this over here. It was very hard to see. Nobody's really wrote about it or put a picture in their publication of it. But this is another cirque tarn with a moraine from that cirque. But it's one of the best developed in the Rattlesnake. Yes. Also, there's been a little bit of work done on trying to radiometrically date this moraine, and it comes out to being like 3,000 years old. So while our glacial maximum here in Missoula was probably around 20 to 18,000 years ago, ice would have still hung on in a lot of places, just like glacier. You still have those tiny little glaciers hanging out, even though things have warmed up. And so some of the Rattlesnake, the higher areas of Rattlesnake Creek, would have still had glaciers about 3,000 years ago. And then we have High Falls Creek, which is very hard to see, but all of these contour lines are very close together. And whenever you have contour lines that are close together, it means it's really steep. And so the thought process is that this is the main glacier lobe here. And there would have been another one coming out of High Falls Creek. And this right here is a hanging valley. But if we zoom back out and look at the whole watershed, we can look a little closer at the southern edge of the Rattlesnake. So we can zoom in here, and there's a very important feature right there, that weird little vertical line. That's really, really important. So this is about 7 or 8 miles north of Missoula. This is about 3 miles in from the trailhead. And the Rattlesnake Creek swings to the south and then cuts this narrow gap through a boundary of gravel that's anywhere from about 100 to 200 feet high. And this is probably the terminal moraine of Rattlesnake Creek Glacier. So that main glacier that came down stopped about right there, at least the last time. And it's about 800 feet above the valley floor, and it's also kind of at an elevation of the glacial lake Missoula, too. So water would have backed up in here. and the glacier wouldn't have been able to go down any farther. But that right there, that little feature, you can go see it and touch it, take pictures of it, share it with all of your friends. They'll be like, why are you sending me a picture of a gravel dump? But the outwash continued, so you can kind of see there's kind of a flat area downstream from it. And so as the water and the outwash continued to come out of all the little baby glaciers up there, you would have still had gravel outwashing down the entire Rattlesnake Creek. But that is where the terminal moraine would have been. So here's much closer. Why didn't I just show this one? So here, this whole thing right here, and you can kind of see how the contour lines just stop right up against here. That is where this big lobe would have come down and just boop, and didn't go any farther and just built up a bunch of gravel right there. So, yes. Now, if we look at the geology of kind of the Missoula Valley and look at the rattlesnake here, we can see a couple of things, and for all of you not geologists, I'll tell you what all the symbols mean. So the YB is the belt supergroup, so these rocks are about 1.5 billion years old. That's why we don't have a lot of great fossils in Missoula, because most of our rocks are way too old. Then you have the Renova Formation, which is this PR down here. This is anywhere from 48 to 20 million years old. I think it's closer to probably 40. And then the NS, here we go. And up there. That is the 6 Mile Creek Formation. And if you did read my article, the Renova Formation will sound familiar to you. That's the formation that has the coal and the plant fossils in it. Then you have the landslides, this QLS, are landslides. The alluvium over here, some portion. So remember, there's been multiple glaciations, so sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what gravel the glacier came from. So this one is just general Pleistocene. But then we have the Rattlesnake Creek, and that's the big alluvial fan. This is all that glacial outwash that's coming down Rattlesnake Creek from the northern portion of the Rattlesnake, and it's filling up the valley here with all of this bouldery gravel. And it's probably around 10,000 years old. That's probably kind of one of the big last melts before we just got tiny little alpine glaciers and things like that. Yes. So the last thing I want to talk about for the rattlesnake is the landslides, because that's an important feature. This is a picture from Google Earth, so it's kind of weird, but if you are over on if you're in the North Hills, hiking over here, if you're looking back towards the mountains, you can see that the land is all kind of hummocky. It looks like very, it's not very smooth. It doesn't look like the edges of Mount Sentinel or Jumbo that are very smooth. It looks very weird. There's also really no strand lines. So you're looking at strand lines, and all of a sudden you get to all of this junk down here, and there's no strand lines anymore. And so we think that over here on the west side of the Rattlesnake, these landslides might have been caused by the flooding events. So it gets filled up with water. The Renova is full of clay, which sucks up the water. It becomes all slimy and squishy, and it destabilizes. And then they slide down towards the Rattlesnake Valley. Now, depending on who you're reading, this is either all post-glacial Lake Missoula. The landslides happened after the last filling of the lake. Or I guess there's like a little tongue down here close to the road that actually does have a couple of strand lines in it. So if you read the newest edition of the Roadside Geology of Montana, it'll say this is all post-flood. If you read a thesis that came out in the 80s, it'll say this actually happened between flooding events. So somebody needs to go and look and see if it's actually strand lines. Not me, I'm not going to do it. But if you know anybody that wants to figure this out, this is a fun little problem. So it's either right after the floods that these landslides occurred, or between some of the end fillings, though. So if all the way down here had strand lines, it would have been one of the last fillings of the lake. All right. That's about everything I could dig up on glaciation of Rattlesnake Creek. There's actually a lot of glacial features out there to go explore. But now let's talk about all of the animals that would have inhabited this part of the world during the late Pleistocene. So I'm going to focus on megafauna today because they're the funnest to talk about. And generally, it's any animal over 100 pounds, but sometimes people consider megafauna over 1,000 kilograms, so 2,205 pounds. So that's a big difference there. Like I would be considered megafauna, so I kind of like to go with the bigger estimate on these things, and most of the animals I'm going to show you are definitely over 2,000 pounds. Most of these megafauna lived all over the world during this time. The Americas, Eurasia, Africa, Australia all had their own flavor of megafauna. They also moved around, especially between Eurasia and North America by the Beringia land bridge up there at Alaska. And most of them were gone by about 10,000 years ago. So almost all of these are extinct today. We'll start kind of with the biggest, and Montana is very lucky in this sense, is that we have both species of mammoth found in Montana. So we have the big Columbian mammoths, which came up kind of from the south, and the woolly mammoths that came down north, and we just happen to be at this perfect place where we can get both of their remains here in Montana, which is kind of fun. So you can see down here, one is a little bit bigger than the other. This one's probably much fuzzier than that one because it was living in northern, cooler climates than the Columbian mammoth. But we have both of them in Montana. We also have this cool proboscidean called a mastodon, so Mammut americanum. And this is a woolly mammoth, just to give you kind of the size comparison between the two. Now, the differences are vast with these creatures, even though they're in the same family because they have a trunk and tusks, but they had much different teeth. They're kind of on a separate branch than the woolly mammoths. So elephants and mastodons share a common ancestor over 25 million years ago, so they are very diverged from one another. And mastodons appeared in North America about 5 million years ago, and mammoths didn't arrive into North America until the Pleistocene ice ages, so when they were able to come across that land bridge. The last North American proboscidean, so again, the group that includes mammoths and elephants and things like that, went extinct around 10,500 years ago. So we don't have any more of these wonderful creatures in North America. Then, of course, the giant ground sloth, everybody's favorite. These guys were very interesting. We had several species of these giant ground sloths in North America during the time, and their ancestor probably came over to North America about 7 million years ago. This is the famous Jeffersonii one. So President Jefferson was like, go find me all these extinct creatures, Lewis and Clark, and they came back with a giant hand claw, and he was like, oh my God, you found it, and it's really not, it came from this. And so they originally thought that these giant ground sloths were giant carnivores, which is kind of fun, but it's not. And that specimen was found in 1796, and then he told Lewis and Clark to keep your eye out for these giant carnivores that must still be alive. The giant short-faced bears, terrifying. Instead of the grizzlies, I highly encourage us to change to Arctodus. We are the Montana Arctodus, because this is one of the biggest bears that have ever lived, is the giant short-faced bear. So you can see here's a brown bear, which is the closest to a grizzly on this one, and you can see how much bigger this one was. These were around from about 2.5 million to about 12,000 years ago, and they're actually not related to the grizzly bear line. They're related to the sun bear line in South America. So the Tremarctidae, family of bears. We did an Eons episode about these little guys. Well, giant guys and the sun bears. Now, Now, the giant longhorn bison is pretty cool. This is bison latifrons. It had a massive spread on the horns here, and it was just really just massive. I just went to the National Bison Range a couple weeks ago, and man, those are big animals, and these were much bigger animals than them. We also know that bison tended to not see species real strong, so our modern bison antiquus, bison occidentalis, they kind of all intermingled, but as far as we can tell from using ancient DNA from the bison latifrons is they never intermingled. They kept to themselves, unlike all the other bison, which makes their genetics kind of a nightmare. This bison evolved from a species that migrated across the Bering Land Bridge between 240,000 years ago and 220,000 years ago, and is thought to have disappeared by about 21,000 years ago, and it has no living descendants. So this guy's toast, unfortunately, because it would have been cool looking. We also had muskox here in Montana. So I have a skull of one of these muskox. It's not this skull, but it's very similar, of this Butherium bomifrons. And it was found in a cave near Helena. So definitely down here. They are a little bit different than our modern muskox that still are around. They were a little taller, they were a little skinnier, and they had less fur because they lived farther south. So the specimen from that cave near Helena is a little over 11,000 years old, and most of these big bovids like this went extinct about 11,000 years ago. They diverged from the modern muskox 3 million years ago, so they are definitely pretty separate. Living in less frigid climates and things like that. So hopefully one of these skulls is going to be on exhibit at the Ecolacca Museum someday. We also had camels. This blows my mind. You don't normally think of North America being where camels live, but they did. Camels actually, the whole camel lineage evolved in North and South America and moved elsewhere and then went extinct here in North America. We don't know if this camel had 1 hump, 2 humps, no humps. We haven't found any soft tissues, unfortunately, of this, but this was a pretty large camel. And there are several species of camelops that are found in Montana. But we just really don't know if they had a hump or not. Let's see. They appeared during the Middle Pliocene, so about 4 million years ago in southern North America, and became extinct about 11,000 years ago. And camels originated in North America during the Eocene about 44 million years ago, migrated into Eurasia across the Bering Strait, and did great over there. But for whatever reason, they did not do great for the rest of their time in North America. Now, this little horse is not modern horses. So this is a horse before horses go extinct in North America and people brought them back later. So this is one of the most common horses from the late Pleistocene. It ranged all the way from Mexico to Canada, all the way up into Canada. There might be other species, depending on if you're a splitter or a grouper, but probably not. It was probably all the same species of horse. It appeared to diverge around 10 to 5.5 million years ago, and by about 15,000 years ago, Equus, this genus, was spread out all over North America. But it does go extinct about 8,000 years ago in North America, and then the Spanish reintroduced them into North America about 500 years ago. So this would have been our native horse here in North America, and technically all the horses that we have today are feral. They're not supposed to be here, but they're doing well. They're doing great. And then, of course, caribou. So this is one that made it out. This thing is still alive today, doing great, but we also had caribou in Montana. So I have bits and pieces of antler collected from Montana. So we have some in Montana. The oldest fossil of caribou is about 680,000 years old, and it became very, very widespread by about 100,000 years ago. And this is the only cervid species, so the family Cervidae that includes all the deer, where female also have the antlers as well. So they've been around for quite some time. The scimitar cat, Homotherium, did any of you see the news that just came out this week about the little frozen baby one of these? Yeah? Okay, so that's this. The frozen baby that was found is from these guys here. This is the widest ranging felid, I think, of all times. It's one of our only North American predators that made it all the way down into Africa. It would just spread all over the place. We're actually thinking of doing an Eons episode just about this cat because of how amazing it was. This genus diverged about 5 million years ago from other big cats and became widespread, got into Africa, and survived in Eurasia until about 28,000 years ago. It had 4-inch long sabers, so not quite the Smilodon saber, but still a big saber. And we think that it preyed on baby megafauna. Here's our little maybe Colombian mammoth baby, but it seems like that was it for these scimitar cats, were baby megafauna. So if all of your baby megafauna goes extinct, you're kind of doomed as well. The dire wolf. So dire wolves are not Game of Thrones dire wolves. They're much smaller. They're basically the same size as our modern gray wolves. And for a very long time, we thought that modern gray wolves evolved from the dire wolf. Well, after a little bit of looking with some ancient DNA, we found out that no, that is not the case at all. Dire wolves are our native North American canid. They evolved and split from living canids about 5.7 million years ago. And there was no evidence of gene flow between dire wolves and gray wolves. Gray wolves came over from Eurasia a little later and colonized North America and really kind of took over. We're not totally sure what happened to dire wolves. It seems like, okay, you're a wolf, do your wolf thing, but maybe the competition was too much from coyotes and gray wolves. Maybe dire wolves had a little bit more of a specific type of diet, like they only ate megafauna babies or something like that, like the scimitar cat. We're not 100% sure what happened to dire wolves, but they didn't make it while gray wolves and coyotes did, which is unfortunate that we lost our only North American canid. And of course, we have to talk about humans, because we were also around here during Glacial Lake Missoula, during the late Pleistocene for sure. But the timings of humans in North America is very tricky, because we know we came across from Northeast Asia across the Bering Land Bridge during ice-free corridors, but were there multiple waves? And the reason why people are starting to think that, well, maybe there are multiple waves is because we find really old sites. So this Colorado site, the Hartley Mammoth site, is a butchering site that's 38,000 years old. That's really old. That's a lot older than a lot of people anticipated humans being just in Montana or in North America. Then the most recent one are these 23,000-year-old footprints in New Mexico, and then probably the most famous ancient human from Montana is the Anzac Boy, the Clovis burial site, the only Clovis burial site ever found in the world here. And of course, we desecrated it all over the place. He's finally reburied now, but it was pretty rough. And it was dated to about 12.7 thousand years old. So now we're starting to think, well, we know our modern indigenous people are related to Clovis people. But what about these people? What about these people? So now they're starting to think a little bit harder about this, because at least by 14,000 years ago, there were already people in Chile. So again, we still have some really, really late areas. Again, the Channel Islands off of the coast of California by 13,000 years ago. So who are these people, and when did they get here? If we look at the glacial ice during this time, this is looking at bison lineages over time. So you can kind of ignore the little pie charts. But mainly what I want you to see is this is ice and this is not ice. This is from older than 23,000. This is during glacial maximum. And this is afterwards, about 13 to 12,000 years ago. And you can see corridors. We like corridors. We don't like to walk on ice. And so the thinking now is that during this earlier phase, during this earlier corridor, there were people coming down, but they did not give us modern people any of their genetics. So they were kind of a failed migration into North America, and it wasn't until this later migration of people that they actually stuck. Now, what happened to all of the megafauna? We have an 82% extinction rate for megafauna, and there's 38 genera that went extinct during this time that disappeared into North America. And a lot of people like to point fingers at humans. And I'm not saying that we're totally out of blame here, but 15 species disappeared before Clovis even got here. So again, there were earlier phases of people coming into North America, but at least some of them disappeared well before our most famous Clovis were around. And only 5 of the ones that go extinct are found at Clovis kill and scavenge sites. And those are the mammoths, mastodons, gomphotheres, which is another type of proboscidean, horses, and camels are actually found at Clovis sites. And we also find that a lot of these overkill sites from Clovis are mostly species that survived into the present, like bison and elk and moose. So while humans probably definitely have some selection pressure on some of the megafauna, we definitely can't blame humans for everything that went extinct during this time. But definitely put a lot of pressure on these animals. And then again, if you're putting pressure on these animals, the carnivores are going to feel it too. So it might have been a kind of a trickle-down effect of extinction that's happening here. The main driver for all of this is probably climate. So all of these megafauna crashes kind of correspond to dramatic fluctuations in temperature as the Pleistocene ended. That could be it getting way warmer than they were used to, or getting used to it being warm and then it gets really, really cold and then they're not used to it again. So that's the main thing that we see, at least with a lot of the overall extinction from the late Pleistocene. Is probably climate, with some human pressure involved. And lastly, since we're getting close to the holiday season, I wrote a book, and it's available. You can get it at Shakespeare here in town, Fact and Fiction, the Montana Natural History Center has it, and then obviously you can get it wherever books are sold online. But with that, thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? We'll speak into the microphone for the recording, please.
You mentioned that there might be an alternate theory for those kettles up by Nine Pipes.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering if you'd share what that was.
Yes. Oh, what are they called? Did I write it? Hopefully I put it in my notes. There we are. Depressions known as kettled, often pockmarked, blah, 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 blah. Eventually, kettles can be Pinedale glaciation. Oh, I didn't put the other name for them. It begins with a P. It's kind of similar to this, but it has to do with permafrost instead. So not potholes, but it's like, it's not polks. There's colks. Oh, who said it? What was that? Yes, pingos. So you get, like, instead of this being ice, this is permafrost. And the permafrost thaws, basically, and then it collapses. And you get those depressions like that. But seeing how far, especially the Bull Lake glaciation came down, so the older glaciation that's about 150,000 years old, it came definitely all the way down to Nine Pipes. So it wouldn't surprise me if these were kettles instead. So just the dead ice being broken off the edge of the glacier as it retreated.
I had one other question. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you seem to profess a real lack of interest in investigating the strand lines in the North Hills. And I was wondering why that was.
So I don't study quaternary geology, so that's the most recent surface processes that geology does. I would love to be a part of a study like that, going up and tracking all these strand lines. No, that's just kind of a little outside of my expertise. I'm very fossil focused, and there are no fossils in those strand lines. So also I have many side quests right now, and strand line counting would not be at the top of my side quest list right now. But it would be very fascinating. I think going through all of the literature to put together the rattlesnake, the most recent publication that even mentions the rattlesnake was from 2021, which is pretty good. Maybe it's 2022. And it was kind of a meta-analysis. So it just kind of pulled everything that had ever written and not going out and redoing the research. So I think a really great grad project would actually be going out and mapping all the glacial features of Rattlesnake, the watershed. That would be very, very interesting. And then again, compiling all of the stuff that's been done before, maybe get some new radiometric dates on some of these moraines, and get a little bit better picture of the overall evolution of the Rattlesnake Valley. Because there's a lot there. There's a lot up there. Way more than I anticipated before I agreed to this talk. So I think it would be a great master's project, but I'm not looking for a master's project. Yeah. Yeah, so if you know anybody, share.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
What do we know about the vegetation types that were around during the time of Glacial Lake Missoula and this Pleistocene? What were some of the megafauna eating?
Probably the same plants that we have today, minus the things that Europeans brought in. So any of our native plants would have still been around during that time. When I look at the diversity of plants from about 40 million years ago, there's only a couple of weird ones. Everything else is literally still here today. So the Missoula plant life, at least, has been fairly consistent through tens of millions of years, actually, here in the valley. But as we get closer to present time, you would start to see a lot more of our modern flora around. Yeah, definitely. It would have been very, very similar. Mm-hmm.
Wilder here wants to know if there were saber-toothed tigers around in Missoula.
Right. So first off, it is not a tiger. This is my paleo pet peeve. I am so sorry that you have to be the one to get this wrath, but it's not. It's not a tiger. It's a cat. You can call it a saber-toothed cat. But tigers are modern Panthera tigris. That's it. They're great. That's a tiger. That's the only tiger. But you call a saber-toothed cat, no problem. It definitely is a cat. They did not get this far north. They liked it warm, and it was cold up here. So we did get the scimitar cat, but not the big smilodons up here. Mm-hmm. At least nobody has found any record of them up here yet.
So how are you able to really confidently determine like when these animals were where they were? Like do you just base that off of, the fossils that you see and you can say that, or do you kind of propose something more fluid?
Both. So some of these fossils I mentioned, we have fossils of them the bad part about having like 2,000 years worth of catastrophic floods is that if anything was living and dying in the valley between, they just got washed away. So it's very hard to say with 100% certainty that every single species walked through the Missoula Valley. But on the flip side, most of the species that I show, I have actual fossil evidence from somewhere in Montana. So these are definitely all animals that lived in Montana. Also, I can extrapolate just a little bit. So there is a very famous locality called Natural Trap Cave, and it's like 2 miles south of the border of Montana in Wyoming. So it's in Wyoming, but you can see Montana from that. And it was on a massive migration highway. And tons of animals fell into a hole and died. Super sad, but also super great for me because it tells us what type of life was here. And so I can extrapolate being like, okay, these animals weren't going to be like, oh no, this is the Wyoming border that hasn't been named yet. I'm not going to cross it and go into Montana. So I feel fairly certain that almost every animal that is found in Natural Trap Cave also hung out in Montana a little bit. Did they get all the way up into Missoula? I don't know. So I didn't put the American cheetah on here. I didn't put the like American jaguar, some of the bigger cats. They are found in Natural Trap Cave, but I also don't have any record of them from the state of Montana yet. Again, if they're in Natural Trap, they probably lived and died in Montana as well. So at least everything that I showed today either was found in Natural Trap and remains have been found somewhere in the state of Montana. So there's a very good potential chance that at least the horses, the woolly mammoths, and probably the mastodons and camels were fairly close up here for sure. Mm-hmm.
So I know that the American pronghorn was like the last species of its whole genus that didn't die. For those other species in the genus that did die in the Pleistocene, do we know when roughly that the last other one died out?
Oof, I would have to consult the literature. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. But yeah, pronghorns definitely were a winner. And I didn't put them in here because they're still pronghorns. They don't feel as exotic as caribou, even though caribou are still around. But again, thinking about caribou living in Montana is a little bit of like a mind meld, you know? But yeah, I'm not sure about the other pronghorns. And it probably had to do with competition with new species coming over from Eurasia. I know that like our cows came over, they did really well, but the horses did really bad, but the horses did really great in Eurasia. So it could be something like that. Just lower amounts of what they like to eat. And so you have multiple species all competing for a smaller and smaller resource. And our modern pronghorn happened to have something in their adaptability that allowed them to eke out. But yeah, I would have to Google that, figure out when all the other ones drop out.
I have a question. If we want to learn more about Glacier Lake Missoula and what happened, is there a good book or movie or
There's a
documentary?
lot of resources out there about Glacier Lake Missoula. The newest Roadside Geology of Montana has a really good, like 4-page summary of it. There's also Glacial Lake Missoula and the Humongous Floods, written by David Alt. There's the Cataclysm of the Cascades or something like that. It's kind of more Washington-based Glacial Lake Missoula, but you can't talk about the channeled Scablands without also talking about Glacial Lake Missoula. Eons did an episode, but it's more of a bigger episode about glacial flooding in particular. But obviously Glacial Lake Missoula is featured prominently. This is definitely one of the most famous, if not the most famous glacial lake in the world. And until 1993, it was the largest glacial lake ever discovered. They found a bigger one in Siberia. But yeah, there's quite a few great books. The Natural History Center has a wonderful display. And then there's the Ice Age Flood Institute that has a wonderful road guide that'll take you all the way to Puget Sound and tell you where to stop to look at all the glacial features. I believe they have a little documentary that goes along with it because it plays in the Natural History Center. So definitely, this is the place to be. If you want to look and learn about Glacial Lake Missoula, this is the best place to be for it. Oh, yes! Thank you. It's right here. It's the next. Is it gonna play in here? No internet. Any other questions while I log into the thing?
hot spot?
No, it's gonna happen. It's happening. It's gonna do it. I'm gonna turn off the sound because it just makes like water sound. Okay, so here you go. Here's the bottom of the glacier. This is all the stuff that's getting caught in it. This is the subglacial. So all glaciers have water underneath them. It's like lubing them up to slide across the surface. And so here, some water drops some rocks, and now it's become a spot where the water hits it, slows down a little bit, drops anything, and humps up. It hits into more of the sediment, and that drops out, and that drops out, and that drops out. And it just keeps doing that until these things are like 100 feet tall. But when you have a 2-mile thick glacier, 100 feet, that's nothing. So then the water speeds up even more. The bigger that cavity gets, the more water that can flow through, that increases the erosion from the bottom of the glacier. And so this again is how you get these swarms moving, right? So this water is doing this all over the bottom of a massive ice sheet. Yep. So thanks to Geodoxa, I think this was done by a university somewhere, studying this. Well, yeah. Comes back down, and then it disappears away, and then you left with that weird shaped hole. This is definitely the best example of how drumlins are made. Some of the other ones were pretty bizarre, because again, we really just had no freaking clue how these were formed. So that one seems the most plausible explanation right now for how drumlins are formed, but maybe somebody will come up with a better idea someday.
So would these mostly be formed like in the flatter, wider valleys and not sort of like up in?
Yep, these are usually all
of these are formed usually on a big outwash plain. So as the glacier is retreating usually, these are forming underneath the ice sheet after the ice sheet has come and bulldozed everything flat. So anytime I go up north, especially to like around the Great Lakes region or like northeastern Canada, I'm always like, it's so recently glaciated. Because, you know, as the glaciers retreated, the Northern Territories and places like that were the last ones to have this ice sheet. So they're all super flat. There's a bunch of these little kettles and other like vortice holes, and it's called deranged drainage, where the rivers and streams haven't quite formed yet, so you get a lot of marshland. That's why the insects and the mosquitoes are a nightmare up there, because there's just a bunch of pooling water because it was under ice less than 5,000 years ago. But yeah, so these are the drumlins. So if you get yourselves up to Eureka, I believe you can stop. There's a highway like over here, and there's a little overlook that you can go to and look at the drumlins up near the border.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Callie, and it's wonderful to think about, you know, how high the water was, what might have been roaming around, and really fascinating to hear what was happening in the upper watershed in some of those high lakes up there. So thank you again for your time and for this wonderful presentation.